In the fall of 1987, I got a call from a former undergraduate student with whom I'd done a little bit of climbing in the Sierra Nevada. And he said he'd heard a talk by a guy who was putting together a Everest expedition and had very eclectic ideas about the various types of people he wanted involved, and he was looking for a geologist. So this was to go in the late summer of 1988 to Mount Everest. Let's see now, why can't I advance the slides? I guess maybe there. Okay. So this is Courtney Skinner. He's a outfitter and climber from Pinedale, Wyoming, and he was sort of the organizer and the guy who sort of catalyzed the whole expedition, and he was our leader on the mountain. It turns out it was 1988 was a good year in the state of Wyoming because it was their centennial year. So they used that to help raise money for the expedition. And the name of the group, we were called the Cowboys in Everest. And he was a pretty idealistic fellow in terms of what he was trying to do. So there was a competition among high school teachers around the state of Wyoming to come on this expedition. One fellow, admitting Lance here, one fellow won that and came along and was, one of his roles was making broadcasts back to the high schools in Wyoming. There were 3 other high school teachers that were selected as well or at least 2 others to come along, but they were not having their way paid, I guess, by the expedition. There's a fellow, Steve Martz, who's been a successful sort of outdoor mountaineering movie maker who came along. Peter Breslow from NPR. Some of you may have heard him many times. He does weekend edition Saturdays and was sort of Scott Simon's right-hand man. Came along and made broadcasts back to NPR. And these broadcasts were amazing. He won a Peabody Award based on his broadcasts. Courtney wanted to try to get the oldest American woman maybe the oldest woman at that time to the summit of Everest. So we had a 55-year-old woman with us. We had a couple of different artists, as I noted here, and 3 doctors were along with us, and a sort of a newly invented thing called the Gamow bag, which I'll show you in a little bit, but it's a hyperbaric bag where you can raise the pressure inside the bag above the ambient outside temperature. Tibetan linguist and one geologist, which was me. So how do you select the people to go? A lot of people would like to go. I do now. Tom will admit. So they had a selection trip, which was for 10 days in the Wind River Range in early January of 1988. Temperatures during that time are typically 0 and below in the mountains of the Wind Rivers. And I was living in Torrance, California, where the temperatures are quite a bit warmer, as you would know. So I was quite concerned about this. However, I'd done some experiments with high school students a couple of years before, working on a project with Rachel's brother. And I knew that I could acclimatize myself by soaking my hands in ice water for about 10 to 15 minutes a day. A very, very painful thing initially. Gradually, your brain learns that if the rest of your body's warm, it can shunt blood to your extremities and keep them warm. And that served me in good stead. So I actually survived this trip. We had one major incident on the trip where a guy came down with pulmonary edema, and we had to evacuate him, make a makeshift sledge out of skis and haul him down the mountain. And eventually a helicopter was able to fly in and fly him out. So we never got to the peaks that we were expecting or hoping to climb. Let's see. go. So we're going to be flying all this stuff from the US, 40,000 pounds of equipment. The Chinese, it turned out, wanted to test an American helicopter up on the Tibetan Plateau. And so this big C5 Galaxy plane, which can hold a helicopter inside it, was going to do this. And through some connections, we were going to be able to hitch a ride on that train. So we canceled our tickets on China Air. And let's see what I have to do. And so we flew from San Francisco to Dover, Delaware, which is where we got the helicopter, and then to Anchorage and Okinawa, and to a base there, and then into Beijing was the plan, and then on to Lhasa. And there's just one little major hitch there, which the Chinese were unhappy about, the fact that we had canceled our paid tickets on their airlines and wouldn't let us fly to Lhasa. Actually, we were held up in Okinawa for a few days. Then we flew to Beijing and we sat there for a few days, and we had a whole lot of delays that took place. They, rather than flying us to Lhasa, they flew us to Chengdu. Eventually we flew to Lhasa, all with separate, tickets that we had to buy along the way. So we had a week's delay as we got started, which is not good because winter was oncoming. And one of the key things to note is we only had our handbags with us. All our luggage and all the supplies, everything was dumped on the runway there in Beijing in the pouring rain. And we were stuck with just whatever we had for carry-on on the plane. Well, let's see, I have to keep jumping between two different screens here. But here's Lhasa. This is the famed Patala Palace there. It's the home of Tibetan Buddhism and ostensibly of the Dalai Lama. Of course, he fled from there decades ago, but it's a remarkable place. Lots of pilgrims and some wonderful architecture, etc. And our plan, so we had a couple days in Lhasa. We were up at 12,000 feet, starting to acclimatize there. And our plan was then to, go to Shigatse and Tingri and on to Everest, which was very nearby. But we had a little problem. So our gear was going to come by by truck across the Tibetan Plateau from Beijing. And we were waiting for it to arrive, and it didn't arrive. So we eventually headed off to Tingri, where we sat for 6 days waiting for our gear. It's a place we called it was a little supposed guest house that we stayed in, where they charged us an arm and a leg to stay as we waited for our gear. It was a place where there were light bulbs, one in each room, hanging from a long cord from the ceiling. There was no running water and no heat, and repetitive lousy food from day to day. So we sat there for a week, and eventually the trucks arrived with our gear, and we were so excited to have this all arrive. 3 or 4 different trucks came in, and we pulled out our bags and pulled out our boots. Mine were covered with mold, having been soaking wet for a couple weeks, and everybody was confronting issues like that. But we were very happy to have our gear, and we headed off to the Everest base camp the next morning. However, the night before we left, there was an earthquake in Nepal and Bhutan that killed 1,000 people and collapsed a whole lot of homes. And we discovered the next day that it also collapsed the part of the road that we were supposed to drive across, which you can see here. This was quite an impediment for us. So what do we do? Well, you could see this little bit that's still intact. We carried 40,000 pounds of gear around that and left it here on the bridge. We camped on the bridge to guard our stuff because Tibetans are would be perfectly happy to help themselves to things that were sitting loosely and unguarded. So we had night patrols all night. I still remember that, you know, we tried to invoke a good sense of humor. So every time we passed another night watchman, we'd say, "Full moon, the ducks are on the pond." That was our, those were our code words. And I celebrated my 37th birthday on this bridge. And we had some real drama there. So there are trucks that had come in each direction wanting to get across the bridge there. Of course they couldn't, but one guy said he could drive across, and he went here. I don't know, can you see my pointer when I was working?
Yeah.
Anyway, above this blue truck that's not in the water, and it's upstream, and he was able to get across the river and down, and so that was great. And other drivers said, "Oh, we can do that." And two of them in these two trucks you see here headed upstream. And of course, it's a lot different trying to do it upstream versus downstream. And they both got stuck, and we had very dramatic rescues. In fact, from the truck on the right, we had it. There was about a 9-year-old boy that we had to, we used our climbing ropes and strung them all the way across the river, kept them taut. We're able to get connected to this boy and drag him across. And then we connected the rope to the other truck, and a guy was
Wow.
you see shimmying across the river at that point. So that was our drama on the way to the base camp. Here's our base camp after several days of setup, and it had a lot of different functions. So most important function probably was the cook tent and the eating and meeting places, but we had this communications structure with all the radios, walkie-talkies, but also the ability to broadcast back, you know, to the states, which was interesting. And we were divided into sort of 4 teams of 6 people. And ours included 1 teacher, myself studying rocks, 1 artist, guy who was the sort of climbing and expedition specialist, and person in telecommunications. So we called ourselves the Tractors, which was our acronym. And this is what it looks like on a windy day from base camp there, where the summit of Everest is up in here. And you have, you know, probably 90-mile-an-hour winds whipping across there. As you move from summer towards fall, and we were supposed to be there by the 10th of August, and we were now about 3 weeks after that when we got to our base camp. The high pressure system that's in the northern Asia in the summertime swings to the south and impinges on topography like that of the Himalaya, and you get tremendously high winds building up during that time. Anyway, this is a peaceful shot from our base camp. We wanted to just give you a set of scales. So we broke up into different teams. I was doing geological field work. One of the things I was focusing on was the glacial history here and trying to test out a theory that had been proposed about an ice cap on Tibet and its exit down past Mount Everest in the past. So there are a lot of these ridges we are called glacial moraines that were visible from camp. I'm standing probably at about 18,000 feet looking down at the base. So you can see the base camp down there, that tiny set of slightly colorful tents, and the heights of these moraines are probably 500 feet high, and looking up to the nearby peaks, which are going up to about 19,000 feet or so at the top. And I mentioned this bag, this Gamow bag. It's one where if someone has pulmonary edema and their lungs are starting to fill with water, you can put them in this bag, and you pump it up with a foot pump here. until it's a couple of PSI above air pressure. So if you're at 17,000 feet, as we were at our base camp, you put someone in that bag and pump it up, and it's as if they're at 12,000 feet. So most people are able to recover pretty well under those circumstances. The drawback of the bag is you have to keep venting it because you don't want CO2 to build up inside. So there's a vent in it. There's a plastic window where you can look inside to look at the person inside, but you have this foot pump that you have to pump 4 times a minute. And I have some vivid and not necessarily happy memories of pumping, being up from 2 a.m. to 3 a.m. in the morning when it was a bit below zero, pumping on this. Pulmonary edema was lying inside there in a nice warm sleeping bag and snoring as they're gradually recovering from their pulmonary edema. We had about 4 or 5 different times this was used with I think 3 different members of our team, and one guy, the same guy had gotten ill in the Wind River Range, had to leave, had to go out with a separate truck.
Was this useful with a guy with pulmonary embolism?
Yeah, with the pulmonary edema, it was, he had this problem with the lungs filling with water, and it was helpful, but we just couldn't afford to have someone who kept coming down with pulmonary edema on the trip, so he went out. So here's on the right is sort of a Google Earth view of the area. You can see where our base camp is at the bottom. While I was doing geology, other people were setting up Camp 1 and Camp 2. So this is about 18,000 feet. This is about 19,500. Camp 3, which is also our so-called advanced base camp, was up at about 21,000. And then here's the North Col, a famous, a col is a saddle, up at about 23,000 feet. Camp 5 was going to be at 25,000 feet. This would be close to 27,000 feet, Camp 6, and then on up to the top. This is the classic route that the British tried and were working on in the 1920s, when people like Maori and Irvine were lost, having been seen somewhere up pretty close to the summit, up above, around 28,000 feet was the last time they were seen. So that was the plan. So it's been climbed quite a few times. Meanwhile, I was back doing geology out of the base camp, and one of the sort of guidelines for climbers, if you are trying to acclimatize to being at high altitude, is climb high, sleep low. So you are making your body work high at high altitude, but then you're sleeping down where you can recover fully. And I was doing that every day, going up 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet or 3,000 feet, doing rock collections and looking at these glaciers and stuff. I had many times when I was working on the other side of the valley from our base camp, I had a open start to the day because I took across at the beginning and end of each day. And by the end of September and October, there were, it was below freezing at night, well below freezing, and we'd get little ice rafts coming down the river, which I realized this when I was out of water and saw all these little in my leg of my knees from the ice hitting into it. And in the meantime, other teams were putting up camps 1 and 2. So our next role was to, with my team, was to go up and establish this advanced base camp up at 21,000 feet. So in most of the expeditions in Nepal, or virtually all of them, they use Sherpas that are carrying loads up the mountains. They don't have Sherpas in Tibet, at least they didn't back in 1988. So we used jacks, and we had I think six different yak herders, 5 or 6 different yak herders. They each had 3 yaks apiece. Each yak could carry 120 pounds. They wanted the bags weighed to make sure they were no more than 60 pounds each, and they'd each yak would have a couple of bags. So we spent a lot of time divvying up loads and heading up the mountain. And as I mentioned, our goal was to complete the route from Camp 2 up to Camp 3 and set up what we called Advanced Base Camp up at 21,000 feet.
Much does a yak by itself weigh? They're not big, are they?
I would guess of 300 pounds or something. I don't know. What's a big cow weigh?
Okay, anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. 900. Okay, so all right, they're this, they're good sized, as you'll see in a moment. Above Camp 2, we discovered this little problem, which was that there was a crevasse across the way that we were, this kind of icy fin in the midst of it, which was very narrow, and there's no way the yaks were going to cross that. So we spent about 2 days, and there's no wood around or things that you could use to try to bridge this. So we spent a couple of days putting down ice pickets, these sort of snow stakes that are about 1 meter long, bridging them across, finding ways, moving in big stones, and gradually building up a platform across here that was about 3 feet wide and pretty flat for these yaks to walk across. And the yak herders came up and looked at it and said, "Yep, no problem. Our yaks will go across that." And so they would get, and here you can see how the yaks loaded with these huge bundles and such on them. They would, in each yak herder, as I mentioned, had 3 yaks. So here are 6 yak herders with one driver's 3 yaks there, who he said, "Yeah, my yaks will go across." And they got behind them and they'd all be throwing rocks at the yaks to try to get them to go across the bridge. And they would inch closer, and then suddenly they would just whirl around and come dashing down the mountainside, sometimes shaking off their bags. All the yak herders would leap out of the way. And then the next guy would say, "Oh, my yaks will do this." And we went through that at least 3 times before finally one yak, the lead yak, just put his foot out on the bridge and took another step and then walked across, and then all the rest just went across with no problem. It was amazing to see. So that got us up to our advanced base camp, which was in a fairly spectacular site. We're looking up to the east here, where the peaks are going up. We're looking at up to about 26,000 feet or so here, and there were some pretty tremendous avalanches that came down off of this towards our base camp. None of them actually hit the base camp, but here's one that I've just sort of outlined with these arrows here that's whipping down, and they're pretty frightening when you hear these roars, particularly during the middle of the night. Can sort of disturb your sleep, let's say. Oh, after yes, I was wondering, why did I do this? After we finished our putting up the advanced base camp, our team, the tractors, went back down to the base where we had a week or so of rest before heading up again. And I was off doing geology each of those days, and other people were working on various other tasks. And in the meantime, the other teams were working on setting up the route up to the North Col. And I, based on my field work, I was able, along with a Chinese colleague, young guy who was with us on the trip out of Lanzhou, we got data together that we were able to publish a paper about the glaciers there, the timing of their advances, and sort of concluding that there definitely was no Tibetan ice sheet that came down through this area in the past 40,000 years. So here's a view from the advanced base camp up to North Pole, 2,000 meters higher up. And it's, I have to say, I apologize for the quality of these images. They are scans and then screenshots and then another try to modification to get them to look a little better. I have much better pictures, but I didn't have the equipment to put really detailed shots. But here you can see a little streak along here. This is one part of the track. It heads up through here, and eventually there's another track up through here and up to the North Col. So it was steep. We had fixed ropes. So those are ones that are secured either with pickets, these snow stakes, or with ice screws into the ice. And you're usually attached to them with something that's attached to your climbing harness that you slide up, something called a jumar that you can slide up one way and it catches so you don't go down the other way. I remember the first time I was going up with another fellow, we were in about the position of this lower arrow, and an avalanche set off just above us and off to the right, and he yelled, "Run!" And I just sat down on my knees and started laughing because there's no way we could run up there. We didn't have enough breath. In fact, most people would take one step and then 4 breaths, or sometimes one step then 5 breaths. The air was so thin. I was fortunate, and through all the climbing I'd done and stuff to acclimatize in a way where I could usually do 1 step and 3 breaths. So I was, 30% faster than the other people going up here. As you got to the top, you're finally breathing a big sigh of relief when you get up here by the North Col. But there's one more major obstacle top. So you're coming across, so you can see these little black dots. Those are people coming across who have just traversed this little obstacle, which was a big crevasse that was intimidatingly deep. And you got up here tired, having gone up this big climb with 50 pounds on your back, with your ice axe. You can see we have crampons on our boots. So you can see these pointy bits on the base of the boots up here. And you got this heavy pack. We would attach our pack to a safety rope off on the side here. So if you fell off the ladder, you could get out of your pack and let it hang there and try to recover yourself out of this hole. But it was really scary. I mean, the first time I went across there, your arms are going back and forth on this ladder. Every time you move, you're worried about tipping over. I almost peed in my pants going across there. I was so frightened. It got to the point where we were pretty used to it and knew how to handle it and could zip back and forth pretty comfortably. And in fact, we had to do that because many of the teams that had been carrying up loads dropped their loads on the other side, on the downhill side of this ladder. And as we were setting up this camp, we had to carry all that stuff across the ladder. So this is me on the North Col on a calm and moderately warm day. So this was dressed for the occasion there. I don't even have on big mittens there. I just wearing gloves. And of course, by this time we'd been there about a month and we're pretty well acclimatized to the cold. And our goal then was to set up Camp 4 up at 23,000. Sorry, at what? This is the camp. Oh, this is Camp 4. Yes, on the call here with the 5 tents or 4 or 5 tents that you see here. We were going to try to set up Camp 5 up at 25,000 feet up this wind-blown ridge that you can see on the right here. That was our goal. 3 of us stayed up on the North Col overnight with a plan to do this, to start carrying loads up there and set up a new camp. We headed off the next morning with a tent and various other stoves and food and things to leave up there. And but again, you're only going one step, 3 breaths, or one step, 4 breaths. And one of the guys just couldn't get his feet warm. After half an hour, his feet were still freezing. And so just because you're moving so slowly, even despite the fact that you might be carrying 50 pounds or 60 pounds on your back. So he headed back down. And the other fellow, Ted, and I headed up and managed to make it up to 25,000 feet, where we set up the camp, this tent, up at 25,000. So we dug this into the hillside, put in a bunch of guy lines to try to stabilize it in the wind, and left the extra gear that we had there, and then headed back down to the North Col, deciding we'd do a rest day there. And during that day, I did a bit of geology around the North Col and collected a bunch of rock samples. And then our goal was to come up and sleep in this tent, carry more gear up there, sleep in the tent, and then climb up to try to get above 8,000 meters, which is sort of a magical height for climbers that they always talk about, the peaks around the world that are above 8,000 meters high, which would have been about 1,000 feet above this camp. So that was our plan, except in the morning, my partner, Ted, woke up and was coughing up blood. And so we debated, what are we going to do? And we decided, well, we'll head off, see if we can do a carry up to there, bring up a bunch of oxygen cylinders and such. But decided to guarantee that we don't spend the night up there, we're going to leave our sleeping bags back at the North Col in the camp there. So we actually made it up there and brought up, I think, 40 pounds or 50 pounds of oxygen cylinders and such, and supplies for the tent, secured it a little bit more. And then we ran down the mountain back to the North Col, grabbed stuff there, ran on down to the advanced base camp. And by the next day, Ted was down at the true base camp. So we dropped all the way from 25,000 feet down to 17,000 feet. It turns out no one else ever got up to the advanced base camp or to this high camp again. The winds picked up even more, and they just got stopped in their tracks trying to go up this this windblown ridge that you see in this image here. So we ended up being the highest people on the trip. A few days doing some more geology, and then but I was becoming aware that my memory was getting worse and worse. My wife would attest that it's even far worse now, but simple things that you were doing every day, like taking a pill or doing whatever it was, I found I suddenly couldn't remember the name of things. And so I decided it was time to get back down to base camp. However, we had some skis along, and so I wanted to do one ski trip. So I recruited one other guy, and we skied up to this saddle at about 22,000 feet or so with skins, where we were between these two massive mountains, between Everest and Makalu, which is just a spectacular peak, and then got to ski down, and pretty soon headed out back to this camp. In the meantime, as these winds picked up, the camp on the North Col was completely destroyed. I don't know, completely destroyed. Things were knocked down. We had one pretty heavy guy who was probably 220 pounds or something rather on the trip, and a tent was starting to blow away, and he leapt on top of this tent with his arms and legs spread eagled to hold it down, and the whole thing started lifting up and he rolled off it, and the tent just blew away. So that was the end of those efforts. Interestingly, so this is a as you can see, a very poor quality picture, but this is me at the end of the trip. I'd lost about 7 pounds, but my hair grew. I had a beard, I don't know, 3/4 inch long or something at that point. It was interesting. Most of the other people on the trip had lost 20 to 35 pounds, some even more. Many of them, including swarthy guys, had almost no beard growth. And it just showed how much this high altitude and the sort of trying conditions slowed down a lot of these normal body functions. Anyway, fortunately, our exit from Everest was much faster than our entrance there, and we were back down to Beijing a few days later and heading home. So that's the end of our story, and it was a remarkable trip, interesting experience. I made good friends, particularly with the people on the team. Got higher than I ever expected to in the mountains, and did some interesting science, which made it fun as well.
Incredible.
I'm surprised you could find any rocks in the middle of all of those snow fields.
Yeah, well, but you can see, I mean, here's this picture. There's the summit of Mount Everest, and there are rocks, exposed, rock bands, because it's steep enough, virtually all the way up to the top. It was interesting. The monsoon happens, the Indian summer monsoon is in the summertime. We were there in the post-monsoon season. Most of the climbing that is done in Nepal, for example, and from this side as well, is done in the pre-monsoon season, so until the early May. We were there post-monsoon, so the weather is good, but it's colder, you're in the fall, and the winds are higher. So this mountain, if I had a picture from when we first arrived, was really clad with snow then, and the winds blew a whole lot of that snow off. So there's much more rock exposed when we left in October than there had been when we arrived in the last part of August, for example, which was interesting.
Doug, in retrospect, if you hadn't had those delays with the original plane flight and everything, so that you could have saved, I don't know,
Yeah.
a couple of weeks, how much of a difference would that have made in the ease of the trip?
I think it would have made a big difference, because it really was the winds. We had, some very strong climbers. So I think there was a good chance we could have succeeded. This is a climb that's done a fair bit now. You can see that this upper ridge here is not very steep. There are some famous steps. There's something called the first step and the second step, and there's another one over here up at about 28,000 feet, which are technical and challenging, and from a climbing point of view, especially when you're doing them up at those altitudes. But the British had climbed up through here, and we're somewhere up in this area where they were last seen in 1922 or 24, I guess it was, 22 or anyway, early 20s. So it's not super technical. The route that I really love is one that the Americans did in 1963, when the first Americans climbed on the normal route, the quote normal route on the south side that Hillary had done. But a team of Americans, suddenly, whoops, it's not what I wanted. But a team of Americans traversed two guys, Willie Unsold and Tom Hornbein, traversed from the right of this image here in the shadows, and then up through this gully. So this beautiful straight line to the summit, and made it up to the top, and then they reunited with a couple of Americans that have come up, Unsold, or not Unsold, but two other climbers whose names I've forgotten for the moment, near the summit, and they all ended up bivouacking up at 27,000 feet with no sleeping bags and no tents. And only one of them complained about their feet being really cold, and the others were willing to, take off the person's boots and warm their feet against their bellies, this guy's feet against their bellies during the night. The other one said, no, their feet are okay. As it turned out, those three froze all their toes, and they were amputated. And the one fellow who had the cold feet actually kept all of his toes. So it's interesting.
Hey, Doug, what was waiting for you when you got back to where the earthquake had caved in the road and you had to cross the river when you?
Yeah, they'd put in a makeshift repair across there so that we were able to just drive across it. Yeah, that was good. Of course, that was 5 weeks later or something like that. Yeah. And this is a major road, not the part that you have to turn off of it to go south to Everest, but the road from Lhasa to Kathmandu basically is going along there.
That route you described that the Americans took up that dark place, looks like it's almost vertical.
Yeah, it's pretty steep. It's probably 50 degrees. I mean, the biggest, there's no place to stop really. I mean, to set up a camp or something like that. They I think, bivouacked somewhere down in here, and then just pushed in one big push all the way up to the summit, and then as far down on the other side as they could. But it's steep. It's probably 50 degrees, as I said.
So what's the height? What was the height of their last camp before?
The one I set up was at about 25,000. It would be
right,
just
in the situation with the Americans that went.
Oh, the Americans.
Yeah.
I think they were probably close to 25,000 feet.
So they were able to go 3,000 feet in one push.
Yep, they were using oxygen. But I had it set as low as they could, I remember, and they joked with each other as they were climbing about how little oxygen they were using. But that was another reason that they got so cold at night, because they were being up at 27,000 feet and were oxygen deprived.
Sure.
At that.
Well, I mean, from the standpoint of the people that didn't feel the pain, losing their toes, it makes perfect sense, because once you've lost sensation, you can have a completely gangrenous toe or foot and have no longer any feelings. Whereas the one that was feeling pain still had a viable extremity. And that person gave the warning sign, and the ones that did lose their toe helped him save his foot. But it makes perfect sense. So it's kind of a paradox that you have no feeling, and you're too far along. And you can see how that would happen with all the distress. I just have one comment to make, Doug. I'm just completely blown away. I am enthralled that you this is a very, in my view, my humble opinion, this is it's an incredible achievement. Incredible.
Unbelievable.
I'm just absolutely flabbergasted that you were part of such a monumental effort. And to me, it was a success, looking at it from my point of view, whether you summited or not. You're to be given a tremendous amount of credit for having, number one, attempted this, and for having gone about and done your job and collected rocks and done what geologists do in the midst of trying to survive it. And my hat's off, really. I'm really impressed. What a remarkable achievement.
Well, thank you. That's gratifying to hear. Mountaineers are used to putting up with hard conditions and this sort of thing. And fortunately, I acclimatized very well, and I was used to the cold, so that certainly helped.
Yeah, being from Torrance, you would be used to it.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, exactly.
Rachel's brother and I taught a course called the Mountains in Winter, where we took 10 high school students into the Adirondacks, the White Mountains, and up into Katahdin in Maine during January, February, and March. So we were camped, for example, on the highest peak in New York State when it was below 20 below zero, and summited in high winds there. So we had conditions that were, except for the fact that there was plenty of oxygen when you're at 5,000 feet.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was part of
your memory. Doug, what was your marital status at the time? Did you have family hanging out at home, figure out what the heck was going on?
Rachel would tell you a whole different story. Her perspective is certainly different, but I was on sabbatical, and we were going to be spending the year at Cambridge University in England. I had left them in Switzerland and flown back to the States for a couple days to prepare for this trip and meet people in San Francisco. I'd arranged an apartment, or we'd arranged an apartment for them in Paris, and they were there for a month or so, and we had a car, a French Renault wagon that I kept and used for field work in Europe for a number of years. Rachel had the wonderful opportunity with two young girls who were 4 and 7 years old to put everything into that car, drive to the ferry across to England, and come off from a right-hand drive country into a left-hand drive country, and drive to Cambridge, where all the stuff that we'd shipped, there was some sort of mail strike in the States, so all the stuff that had been shipped to Cambridge hadn't arrived yet. So she has a whole lot of tales to tell about how appreciative she was of my absence.
Hey, Doug, the other thing about Rachel is that was the way she learned that you were going to make this trek up the mountain there. Tell them about that.
What was it?
Remember, she heard about it at a party when you were telling other people or something like that?
Oh, yes, I think that was
I think you tried to repress that, Doug. Sounds like not a good thing.
My faulty memory, and yes, she tends to remember those sorts of details. Yes, someone asked me about it. I said I was going to go. Yeah, well, it was obviously it was a big event in my life, and so I'm glad I did it, but it certainly put stress on other people, and there are lots of people who are just worried about your safety. I had a couple of different phone calls back at the time, and was able to talk to Rachel a couple times. She remembers the call as me saying, "Oh, how's Andrea?" and wanted to hear about our daughter. "Oh, how's Hillary?" and then switching to another topic and not asking, "How's Rachel?" So, I attribute it all to brain fog at high altitude, but
Well, it's a remarkable story. I'm sure it's some of the events that occur in our lives are things that are permanently embedded, and I'm sure that you have your grandchildren will be telling this story as well. And this is really one for history.
Yeah, we're recording this, so they'll be able to watch this this video and this slideshow. I learned so much more this time than I did last time when you just gave an oral presentation at your house during one of the breakfasts. So, seeing all the maps and all of the diagrams and so forth, and all the players in this drama really added a whole new dimension. So I'm glad we did it today on this final, perhaps final for a while Zoom call, unless we have another pandemic or something, or people want to somehow do some kind of hybrid. Somebody mentioned that maybe we should do both, for those people who can't come to the live in-person breakfast that we're going to reinstate next week at Fred's. But we'll maybe discuss that in person. So if there are no more questions here,
Hey, Doug, thanks for
Doug.
doing that remote,
Yeah,
man.
thank you again,
Thank you.
Doug.
Yeah.
Thank you,
very good.
Doug.
Fabulous.
Thanks, Doug.